Okay, I get that the every flavor beans would have an earwax flavored bean. That's part of their gimmick. When they say every flavor, they literally mean every flavor. However, how does Dumbledore recognize this bean as being flavored earwax? What, has he tasted enough earwax in his lifetime that he can instantly recognize the flavor right off the top of his head? Dumbledore, you have a very strange dietary history. Spoiler warning. This is an in-depth retrospective and story analysis of the entirety of the Harry Potter books, one chapter at a time. If this is your first video in the series, it is highly recommended that you begin watching this series from the beginning, which you can do by going to the playlist that I provide right here. Okay, now that everyone is all caught up, let's continue. So as I pointed out last time, it is actually Quirrell who is trying to steal the Sorcerer's Stone. Also, it turns out that Quirrell doesn't actually have a speech impediment. His stuttering is entirely an act. He explains that it was he who was casting the broom bucking curse on Harry's broom during the first Quidditch game, and that Snape was actually trying to cast a counter curse, much to Harry's shock. Quirrell then conjures up some ropes and ties Harry up with them. What's interesting about that is that even though Quirrell is absolutely using magic against Harry, he doesn't experience agonizing pain due to the sacrificial protection. I suppose that's because it isn't really an offensive spell, it's only meant to restrain Harry, not hurt him. However, it does raise the question of why, later in this chapter when he's trying to get the stone from Harry, he doesn't just use these same ropes to restrain Harry again before just pulling the stone out of his pocket. Harry notices that the obstacle that Dumbledore himself set up was none other than the Mirror of Erised, which Harry first discovered on Christmas night. Harry comes up with a plan. If he can look in the mirror, he might see where the stone is located. Unfortunately, there are two things Harry isn't counting on. The first is that Voldemort is inside Quirrell's turban, meaning he can see Harry at the moment. The second is that Voldemort knows legilimency, meaning he can read Harry's mind and therefore knows what Harry's plan is. So Voldemort tells Quirrell to use Harry to locate the stone, which he does. Rather than show Harry where the stone is hidden, it instead shows him pulling the stone out of his own pocket. Then, the stone miraculously appears in Harry's pocket for real. Harry doesn't understand how that worked, but now is not the time to look a gift horse in the mouth. He gets cast aside and tries to make a break for it. Unfortunately, Voldemort once again uses his legilimency. He tells Quirrell to take off his turban and let Voldemort speak to Harry directly. Ever since his downfall 10 years prior, he has had to resort to possessing someone else in order to be able to do anything. However, now that he's found Quirrell, he hopes to use Quirrell to obtain the Elixir of Life, so he can have a body of his own again. He then informs Harry that he knows about the stone in his pocket. Naturally, Voldemort's demands for the stone go about as well as you'd expect. So with threats and persuasion not working, Quirrell resorts to violence. However, this ends up being just as ineffective as the persuasion and threats, but not for the reasons you would think. Whenever Quirrell tries to touch Harry, his hands are red and raw, like he had just stuck his hands in a raging fire. Just like with how he got the stone, Harry had no time to question how this worked. He simply had to do what he had to do. Since Quirrell's hands were raw, it only makes sense for Harry to lay the smack down on him. So he grabbed Quirrell's face and started to inflict these burns on his head. The pain in his scar becomes greater by the minute. Eventually it gets to the point where he completely passes out and has a feeling of him falling down an endless black abyss. Now, because this is the shortest book in the series, it is the only book in the series to have the climax and following action take place in the same chapter. Even Chamber of Secrets, the second shortest book in the series and only one chapter longer than this one, has its climax and falling action separated by a chapter break. Anyway, Harry wakes up several days later in the hospital wing with Dumbledore looking over him. It's never clarified if Dumbledore has been watching over Harry around the clock or if he just happened to be at Harry's bedside whenever Harry finally opened his eyes. So now it's time for a big fat exposition dump so that everything that happened in this book gets brought full circle. Doesn't that sound exciting? Yay! So as it turns out, what happened down in that cellar was a complete mystery, so naturally the whole school knows. Normally I would complain that this doesn't make one bit of sense, but for once in the entire series, I get the feeling that this wasn't supposed to make sense. So I'll give it a pass. I don't find it funny, but I at least recognize that it is a joke and not just shitty writing. The summons that Dumbledore received was a fake, and this time I do plan on complaining about how little sense it makes. One has to wonder why it took all day for Dumbledore to realize that. Shouldn't he have realized that as soon as he got to the Ministry and they told him that they didn't summon him and don't know what this is about? If he apparated to the Ministry, he would have gotten there instantly. However, in Order of the Phoenix, it is explained that Dumbledore will use a Thestral to travel whenever he doesn't feel like apparating. But even if that's what happened here, Thestrals are damn fast. In that same book, when Harry uses a Thestral to get to the Ministry of Magic, the same place Dumbledore was apparently headed in this book, he's able to get there in only a couple of hours. So how long could it possibly have taken Dumbledore to get to the Ministry and realized he wasn't actually summoned there? He explains that the stone has been destroyed. While this does mean that Nicholas Flamel will die, he explains that Flamel has lived long enough that he now sees death as a natural part of life. Dumbledore also insists that Harry call Voldemort by Voldemort. This is one of the things that Harry and Dumbledore will share with each other that makes them different from most of the other characters for the rest of the series. Unfortunately, Dumbledore states in no uncertain terms that Voldemort still has ways of returning to power. Obviously, this is meant to be a 7-book series, so there would be no point in the other 6 books if Voldemort were finished off for good in the first book. Unfortunately, Dumbledore refuses to tell Harry why Voldemort tried to kill him as a baby. Frankly, I'm surprised Harry even expected Dumbledore to know that. Dumbledore was the only one Voldemort ever feared, but how does that translate into Dumbledore knows everything about Voldemort and how he thinks? So we finally get our first explanation about the sacrificial protection that Harry received from his mom. While we don't yet know the full ins and outs of how sacrificial protection work, in fact I wonder if we still know the full ins and outs even after having read the entire series, it nonetheless sets up Harry's primary advantage over Voldemort. Also, Dumbledore was the one who gave Harry the invisibility cloak, and Snape felt indebted to James Potter for saving his life once, so he decided to spend Harry's first year at Hogwarts watching over James. Well, that and he wanted to bone Lily, but Dumbledore swore to Snape that he would never tell anyone about that. So now we come to the part of this exposition that I have the most gripes with. How Harry was able to get the stone, and if you were expecting me to take this exposition and not rip it a new asshole, well, I feel sorry for you. So, only someone who wanted to find the stone but not use it would be able to get it. Okay, where was it before it ended up in Harry's pocket? Was it inside the mirror? Earlier, Quirrell suggested that he could break the mirror open to get to the stone. Would that have worked? Second, if you could only get the stone if you didn't want to use it, then how was Flamel supposed to get the stone in order to make more elixir of life? Maybe Flamel had already decided he was ready to die, but then why not destroy the stone as soon as it was retrieved from Gringotts? Oh sure, the Super Carlin brothers came up with an extremely well thought out theory that I have referenced several times in this series called Dumbledore's Big Plan, where they theorized that Flamel had volunteered the stone for this purpose. But honestly, why does he need to volunteer the stone for this purpose? You can still destroy the stone in private and still set up all these enchantments to make Voldemort think that you have the stone under lock and key. You want to lure Voldemort to Hogwarts in the hopes of testing Harry's mettle? That's all you really need. You don't actually need bait. You just need to trick Voldemort into thinking that there's bait. Third, shouldn't Quirrell have been able to get the stone without any difficulty? After all, he didn't want to use the stone himself, only give it to Voldemort. Does giving it to someone else count as using it? If so, then that would suggest that Harry had no intention of giving the stone back to Nicholas Flamel, which I refuse to believe, seeing as Harry was in shock to find out that Flamel would die without the stone. Fourth, why the hell didn't Dumbledore just use the Fidelius Charm to protect the stone? Hell, you could have used the Fidelius Charm in tandem with the aforementioned suggestion of using the fake protections to lure Voldemort in. By resorting to this elaborate enchantment whereby only someone who wanted to find the stone but not use it could get it, you have effectively enabled Voldemort to get really damn close to getting the stone. Harry was able to make the stone appear, and it was only because Harry managed to hold Quirrell at bay that kept them from just grabbing the stone and getting out of Dodge. God, this makes no sense. So after Dumbledore leaves, Ron and Hermione also join. Hermione explains that Dumbledore actually met with her, and without her even having to say a word, he instantly knew that Harry had gone after the stone. This is, in my opinion, the hardest evidence that the stone was indeed placed at Hogwarts just to test Harry, because that is literally what Dumbledore expected Harry to do. We also find that, with Harry incapacitated, Gryffindor was flattened by Ravenclaw in the final Quidditch match. Strange, I could have sworn that Harry said back in Chapter 13 that if he didn't play, Gryffindor as a whole would have to forfeit. Also, fun fact, this is the only time in the series when the final Quidditch game of the season will take place after the end of term exams. Then Hagrid comes in and immediately starts bawling like a little bitch. He realizes just how short-sighted he was when he accepted the dragon egg. He swears he'll never drink again. Yeah, let's see how long that lasts. And says he should have been sacked. Harry tries to tell Hagrid not to blame himself, that Voldemort would have found a way past Fluffy regardless. So then Hagrid gives Harry a picture book full of pictures of Harry's parents before they were murdered. He says he got this from Lily and James's old friends, which doesn't make any sense at all. Who exactly did he write to? Sirius is in Azkaban and everyone thinks he's a dark wizard. Pettigrew is presumed dead. Lily's only friend at Hogwarts was Severus Snape, and Hagrid wouldn't have needed an owl to contact him. So, was it just Remus Lupin he wrote to? You're telling me that Lupin alone had enough pictures of the Potters to fill this entire book? Well, that's just a little bit creepy on Lupin's part. So Harry attends the end-of-term feast, and now, all of a sudden, the people are suddenly interested in him again. Like I said earlier, everyone somehow knows about Harry's act of heroism, so I suppose that overrides the ill will they hold against him for costing Gryffindor the House Cup. Or maybe they all realized that they had been too harsh on Harry because, now that the points are in, they realized that Harry didn't actually cost them the House Cup after all. Gryffindor trails Slytherin by 160 points, whereas Harry, Hermione, and Neville only lost 150 points. So even if they hadn't lost Gryffindor those 150 points that night, Slytherin still would have won anyway with a 10-point lead. So clearly Harry didn't actually cost Gryffindor the House Cup after all. Frankly, if Slytherin was trailing behind in the final days of the term, chances are that Snape would just give Slytherin a bunch of points to rig the House Cup in his favor anyway. Like I said back in Chapter 7, the House Cup is total bullshit. But then, Dumbledore does something that only further confirms what I say back in Chapter 7 about the House Cup being total bullshit. He starts handing out Gryffindor points like candy to Ron, Hermione, Harry, and Neville. Frankly, Neville winning the points seems the most transparent attempt by Dumbledore to swing the House Cup in favor of Gryffindor at the last minute, seeing as Neville didn't even participate in saving the Sorcerer's Stone. So, anyway, Gryffindor wins the Teacher's Pet Championship for the first time in 7 years. Whoop-dee-doo! The students get their exam grades back. Yes, I'm calling the points they got on their exams grades rather than marks, because that's what we call them in the USA. Suck my American dick. Neville's aptitude for herbology is established for the first time in the series when it is revealed that his high herbology grade made up for his abysmal potions grade. I have to wonder, does whether or not you pass to the next year depend on the average grades of every class? Here in America, we have what's known as a GPA, or grade point average, that can go all the way up to 4.0, but you still have to pass each individual class in order to graduate the next year. If you get an A+ in math but an F in English, you still get held back a year. Does Hogwarts take the average GPA for your entire year and use that to determine whether you pass or not? We also learned for the first time that Hogwarts students aren't allowed to use magic outside of school. Like Hogwarts' curfew, this mostly exists just to handicap Harry by giving him a rule to break during the summer. Harry's adventures at Hogwarts would be too easy if he were allowed to roam the castle whenever he wanted, so Rowling has to put a curfew in place, even though that doesn't really make that much sense from an in-universe perspective. Simply so Harry can be properly challenged during these adventures. Likewise, the law forbidding underage magic doesn't seem to serve much of an in-universe purpose. You could argue that it's there to maintain the secrecy of the wizarding world, but really, that law is enforced independently of the law regarding underage magic. However, Harry's tribulations at Privet Drive would be largely trivial and overcome way too easily if he could simply magic his way out of any problem with the Dursleys. So Rowling has to implement this law forbidding underage magic just so Harry can be properly challenged at the start of each book as well as in the middle. Much like Quidditch and the House Cup, it exists almost exclusively for its narrative function with little regard for how little sense it makes in-universe. So as they get to King's Cross, Ginny makes a cameo appearance, fangirling over Harry. Meanwhile, the Dursleys show off their cruelty by refusing to even acknowledge Harry as genuine family, instead saying that Harry is only their relative in a manner of speaking. However, the chapter ends on a modestly high note, with Harry reminding his friends, and by proxy the audience, that while Harry isn't allowed to use magic outside of Hogwarts, the Dursleys don't know that yet. So there is at least a silver lining that Harry might be able to exploit that advantage over them. Just like last time, the plot advancement in this chapter should be patently obvious. This is the point where every other mystery in this book so far comes full circle, the only exception being the mystery of why Voldemort tried to kill Harry in the first place. Other than that, there honestly weren't that many mysteries left to solve. The only real mystery that gets solved in this chapter is who Voldemort's servant was all this time. Harry assumed it was Snape, so the only mystery left was revealing that Snape was only a red herring. This certainly isn't Goblet of Fire, where breadcrumb after breadcrumb was sprinkled in across the entire series. Harry continues his character development this chapter, although unlike the previous 2 chapters, he doesn't get the bulk of character development. His primary character development comes in his refusal to buy into Voldemort's bullshit and refusing to be intimidated by his threats. Once again, this shows how much of a leader Harry is by showing his absolute refusal to curb his moral code in exchange for short-term convenience or comfort. Hagrid gets a little bit of redemption this chapter when he realizes just how much he fucked up in the previous chapters. Meanwhile, Ron and Hermione are equally in the background. Well, at least Hermione isn't overshadowing Ron. Neville finally gets some type of reward for his character development of standing up to bullies. However, it honestly feels like it's too little too late. Sure, the points he receives are what ultimately swing the House Cup, but only because Dumbledore left his points until the end. Frankly, he should have gotten those points before the Golden Trio did, seeing as he made his point-earning achievement before the Ron, Hermione, and Harry each made theirs. Even then, all he really won was a completely worthless trophy for his house that he'll never directly benefit from. so having him win a completely bullshit prize is hardly a reward for his character development. Just like how Malfoy got little more than a black eye in Chapter 13, and that was treated as satisfying comeuppance when it was anything but, Neville's 10 measly points is treated by this story as a satisfying reward for his character development when it is anything but. The bulk of character development goes to Albus Dumbledore, who is revealed to be the mastermind and puppeteer behind the events of the entire book. His spell, whereby only someone who wanted to find the stone but not use it would be able to get it, makes absolutely no sense, but everything else gets wrapped up in a nice little bow, and it's impressive that J.K. Rowling is able to pull all of this together, seeing as this book was written when Rowling was at her most inexperienced. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have just completed the final chapter of the first book. But that doesn't mean we are finished with the first book. If you recall, way back in my introductory video to the series, I said that once I've covered every chapter in each book, I would then do a separate video where I look at the book as a whole and give it a ranking. So my next video in the Harry Potter Retrospective series will be exactly that. So tune in next time for the Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone Retrospective. In the meantime, however, I'm Macer Thorn, and I will see you guys later.